Hello dear friends, and welcome back to my channel Storyova. This is the place where quiet voices tell the stories that life writes in the margins. The moments that seem small until they break your heart or change everything. If you enjoy thoughtful, emotional stories about family, memory, and the unexpected turns life takes, make sure you're part of our Storyova family. Now let me tell you something that happened to me. Something that began with a garden and ended with a lesson I never expected to learn. I used to believe a garden could protect a person, not in the dramatic sense, not like walls or locks, but in a softer way. The kind of protection that comes from routine, from small living things that depend on you, from soil that remembers the shape of your hands. My garden sat behind my little house like a quiet promise. It wasn't large. If you stood at the back door and stretched both arms out, you could almost imagine hugging the entire yard. But every corner of that space held a memory. The left side had roses my husband planted the year before he passed away. He insisted they would bloom every spring even if nobody believed in them. The right side had tomatoes, stubborn and wild, the kind that grew crooked but tasted like sunshine. And in the center stood a small apple tree. That tree had been there longer than I had. The previous owner told me it was planted nearly 30 years ago. When I first moved in, it barely produced fruit, but I spoke to it, watered it, trimmed the branches the way my husband used to. 3 years later, it gave me apples so sweet my neighbors began asking if they could have a few. I always said yes, because gardens, in my opinion, were meant to be shared. Every morning I woke up early. Not because I had to, but because my body had learned the rhythm of quiet mornings. I would make tea, open the back door, and step outside with the mug warming my hands. The air always smelled different in the garden. Sometimes like damp earth after rain. Sometimes like roses. Sometimes like tomatoes when the sun warmed their leaves. I would walk the same slow circle every day, checking the soil, touching leaves, whispering small greetings to plants like they were old friends. It might sound silly to some people, but when you've lived long enough, you understand that silence is easier to bear when something green is growing nearby. For 12 years, nothing in that garden changed. Until the morning the trucks arrived. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days the garbage truck came down our street, rumbling slowly like an old animal. But that morning the sound was sharper, louder. Metal clanged. Engines roared. Men shouted. I stepped outside holding my tea, expecting to see construction down the road. Instead, I saw 3 large trucks parked behind my fence. And 4 men standing inside my garden. For a moment I thought I had stepped into the wrong yard. It's strange how the mind works in moments of shock. You don't immediately jump to anger or fear. You simply assume there must be a mistake. I walked closer. One man was already pulling out the wooden stakes that marked my vegetable beds. Another man had a shovel digging into the soil where my tomatoes grew. A third man stood near the apple tree, holding a clipboard. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said. None of them answered. The shovel kept moving. So I spoke louder. "Excuse me. What are you doing in my garden?" The man with the clipboard finally looked at me. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, he looked annoyed. "Ma'am," he said, "we're preparing the area." Preparing the area. I remember repeating that phrase in my head like it was a sentence in a language I didn't understand. "For what?" I asked. "For the parking lot," I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter escapes when the truth is too absurd. "A parking lot," I said slowly. "Yes. In my garden, yes." I pointed toward my house. "This is my property." The man sighed the way people do when they believe they're explaining something obvious to someone who doesn't understand. "The permit's already approved." "What permit?" "For the parking extension behind the new building." I turned around. Across the alley, where an old warehouse used to stand empty for years, a new apartment complex had appeared over the past 6 months. I had watched it rise slowly, floor by floor, like a concrete tree growing where nothing used to be. But the building ended at the alley. My garden sat on the other side. Or at least, it always had. That building, I said carefully, is not on my land. The man flipped a page on his clipboard. We were told this section was included. Included by who? He shrugged. Management. That word made my stomach tighten. Management. Such a simple word. Yet it carries the weight of decisions made in rooms you were never invited into. I walked toward the fence line. The men had already removed 2 wooden posts and part of the wire mesh that separated my garden from the alley. One of them had placed orange markers in the soil, forming a square across the middle of my yard. A square large enough for cars. The tomatoes were gone. The soil had been flattened where the beds once were. And the man with the shovel had started digging near the apple tree. Stop, I said. He didn't. Stop, I repeated louder. The shovel paused. What? He asked. Put the shovel down. He looked toward the clipboard man. The clipboard man shrugged again. We have a schedule, ma'am. Put the shovel down, I said, or I'm calling the police. That got their attention. Not because they were afraid, but because it would delay their work. The shovel hit the ground with a dull thud. I walked back inside the house, hands shaking so badly I spilled tea across the kitchen counter. I stared out the window at the men standing in my garden like they owned it. My garden. The roses. The apple tree. The soil my husband once knelt in. And they were talking about paving it. For cars, I called the city office first. After 12 minutes on hold, a woman answered with a voice that sounded like it had already handled too many complaints that morning. I explained everything. She asked for my address. Then she paused. I heard typing. More typing. Another pause. Well, she said slowly, there is a development permit filed for additional parking behind the Riverside Apartments. That's the building across the alley. Yes, and it includes my property. Another pause. I'm not sure, she said. Someone should be, she sighed. You may need to contact the development company directly. While they're digging up my garden, I'm just telling you what's in the system. I hung up before my voice could crack. Then I stepped back outside. The men had resumed working. 2 of them were now pulling out the rose bushes. I felt something inside my chest twist like a rope being pulled too tight. Stop, I shouted. The man with the shovel looked up again, irritated. We already talked about this. You can't remove those. They're in the marked zone. That's my garden. He pointed toward the clipboard man again. Talk to him. So I did. I walked straight up to him and stood close enough that he couldn't ignore me. Who owns that building? I asked. Riverside Development Group. And who told you my yard is part of their parking lot? Look, he said, we're just following the plan. Show me the plan. He hesitated. Then he turned the clipboard toward me. The paper showed a map of the block. Lines, measurements, little rectangles representing parking spaces. And there, drawn in neat blue ink, was a square labeled parking extension area. That square covered half of my garden. But the property line was wrong. It cut straight through the middle of my yard like someone had drawn it without ever stepping foot here. That's not correct, I said. It's what we were given. That line is wrong. He shrugged again. You'll have to take it up with the developers. Until then, I said, you're trespassing. He looked at the men. Then back at me. All right, he said reluctantly. We'll pause for now. The engines shut off. The digging stopped. But the damage had already begun. The tomatoes were gone. 2 rose bushes lay on the ground with their roots exposed, and the soil near the apple tree had been torn open like a wound. The men packed their tools and left. But as the trucks drove away, I had the strange feeling they would be back. Because people who think they have permission rarely stay gone for long. That afternoon I walked through my garden slowly. The silence felt different now, disturbed, like the ground itself knew something had shifted. I knelt beside the fallen roses and pressed the soil back around their roots. I'm sorry, I whispered. I wasn't sure whether I was apologizing to the plants, or to my husband's memory, or to myself for not protecting this place sooner. The sun dipped lower. The air cooled. And as I sat under the apple tree, brushing dirt from my hands, I realized something important. Someone, somewhere, had looked at my garden on a piece of paper and decided it was empty space. Space that could be replaced with painted lines and parked cars. Space that didn't belong to anyone who mattered. But they were wrong. Because a garden is never just land. It is time. It is care. It is the quiet proof that someone chose to nurture something instead of paving over it. And I wasn't ready to let them erase that. Not without a fight. So the next morning, I put on my coat, gathered every document I owned about this house, and prepared to walk into an office where people believed my garden was already gone. They didn't know yet that the woman who planted tomatoes and talked to apple trees could also be very stubborn. And sometimes stubbornness is the only thing that saves a garden. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had come in short pieces during the night, the kind that never fully rests your mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing those orange markers stuck in my soil like little warnings. I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of me. The house deed. The property survey from when I bought the place 12 years ago. Tax statements. Utility bills. Every document that proved the same simple truth. The garden behind my house belonged to me. I slid them carefully into a large brown envelope. For a moment I stood by the back door and looked outside. The garden looked wounded. The empty patches where my tomatoes had been planted stared back at me like missing teeth. 2 rose bushes leaned sideways where the workers had yanked them halfway out. But the apple tree still stood in the center, calm and steady. The wind rustled its leaves softly, as if nothing had happened. I stepped outside and touched its trunk. "Don't worry," I murmured. "I'm working on it." Then I locked the door and walked toward the city planning office. The building sat downtown, inside a large gray structure that looked more like a bank than a place where people made decisions about neighborhoods. Inside, everything smelled faintly of printer ink and old paper. A young man at the front desk looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," I said, placing my envelope on the counter. "Someone tried to turn my garden into a parking lot yesterday." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That sounds unusual." "That's one word for it." He asked for my address and typed it into his computer. I watched his face carefully as the information loaded. First, confusion. Then concentration. Then a small frown. "Huh," he said. "Huh," I repeated. "There is a development permit attached to your block. For the apartment building across the alley, yes. Riverside Apartments. And according to that permit," I said slowly, "my yard is their parking lot." He hesitated. "Well, it does show additional parking behind the building." "Show me." He turned his monitor slightly so I could see. The same map from the clipboard appeared on the screen. The same blue square. The same incorrect property line. I pulled the folded property survey from my envelope and laid it beside the keyboard. "This is the official survey from when I bought the house." He leaned forward. For a few seconds he compared the 2 maps. Then he leaned back. "These don't match." "No," I said quietly. "They don't." He scratched the back of his neck. "Let me get my supervisor." A few minutes later, a woman in her 50s walked over. Her glasses rested low on her nose, and she carried the tired patience of someone who had spent years dealing with paperwork that never quite behaved. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked. The young man gestured toward the screen. "Property boundary conflict." She studied both maps carefully. Then she asked, "When did the construction crew enter your yard?" "Yesterday morning, and they started removing plants." "Yes." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That shouldn't have happened." "Apparently someone thinks it should." She clicked through several files on the computer. Riverside Development submitted their parking expansion plan 4 months ago. And no one checked the property line. They included a survey, an incorrect one. She nodded slowly. That appears to be the case. I felt my shoulders relax slightly. Finally, someone else was seeing what I saw. So what happens now? I asked. She closed the file and looked at me. Technically, if the property line on their permit is wrong, they cannot build on your land. That's good news. Yes, she said carefully. But it may take time to correct the documentation. Time. The one thing construction companies never like to give. They already started digging, I reminded her. She reached for the phone. I'll contact the site manager and place a temporary stop order until the boundary issue is resolved. I exhaled slowly. Thank you. But the relief didn't last long. Because when she hung up the phone, she said something that made my stomach tighten again. The developer will likely want to speak with you directly. Why? To negotiate. Negotiate what? The use of the land. I stared at her. You mean buying my garden? She didn't answer directly. But the silence was answer enough. I walked out of the office with the stop order in my hand and a strange mix of victory and unease in my chest. Yes, the digging had stopped. But now the people who wanted my land knew they had a problem. And powerful people rarely like problems. They prefer solutions, especially the kind that involve money. When I reached home, I stepped into the backyard immediately. The garden felt quiet again. I knelt beside the roses and carefully pressed the soil back around their roots. They might survive. Roses are stubborn like that. While I worked, I heard a car door close in the alley. Footsteps approached. I looked up. A tall man in a dark suit stood near the broken section of my fence. He looked completely out of place beside the overturned soil and half-uprooted plants. Mrs. Carter? He asked. I nodded. My name is Daniel Brooks. I represent Riverside Development. Of course he did. He stepped closer, glancing briefly at the garden like someone inspecting an empty lot. I understand there's been some confusion regarding the parking extension. Confusion is one way to describe it. He offered a polite smile. We'd like to resolve the matter quickly. I'd like my garden left alone. Yes, about that. He opened a leather folder and removed a sheet of paper. Our company is prepared to make you a very generous offer for this portion of land. I didn't take the paper. I'm not selling my garden. You haven't even heard the amount. I don't need to. He sighed lightly. Mrs. Carter, the apartment complex has over 80 residents. Parking space is extremely limited. That sounds like a problem you should have solved before building it. His smile faded slightly. We assumed the rear property could be acquired. Assumed. Yes, well, I said calmly, you assumed wrong. He glanced at the apple tree. Frankly, this yard is underutilized space. Underutilized. I felt something in my chest spark. This space grows food, I said. It grows flowers. It holds memories. He shifted his weight impatiently. Memories don't solve parking issues. No, I replied quietly. But they're worth protecting. He held out the paper again. At least consider the offer. I took it. Not because I planned to accept it, but because curiosity can be stronger than anger. The number printed on the page made my eyebrows rise. It was more money than I had expected. Enough to replace the garden somewhere else. Enough to make many people say yes. Daniel watched my reaction carefully. You could do a lot with that, he said. Yes, I admitted. I could. He nodded, confident now. So perhaps we can move forward. I folded the paper slowly. Then I handed it back. No. The confidence vanished from his face. May I ask why? I looked around the yard. At the roses. At the broken soil. At the apple tree standing quietly in the middle. Because this garden is not empty land. He exhaled through his nose. If you refuse, the process could become complicated. I imagine it will. We may pursue legal options. You're welcome to try. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he slid the paper back into his folder. We'll be in touch." He turned and walked away. As his car disappeared down the alley, I felt the weight of what had just happened. I had said no to a company with lawyers, money, and influence, all to protect a small backyard garden. Some people might call that foolish. But as I stood beneath the apple tree, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves above me, I realized something important. This fight was no longer just about plants. It was about the way people see the world. To them, land was a square on a map. To me, it was a story written in soil. And I had no intention of letting someone erase that story just to paint white lines for cars. The next few days were strangely calm. Too calm. No trucks returned. No workers appeared. But every afternoon I noticed something else. Residents from the new apartment building began walking through the alley, stopping to look at my garden. Some of them stared curiously. Others whispered to each other. It didn't take long to understand why. Word had spread. Apparently, the old lady behind the building was refusing to sell the land that would solve everyone's parking problems. One evening, a young woman approached the fence. She looked nervous, like someone about to ask a difficult favor. "Excuse me," she said. "Yes. I live in the new building." I guessed as much. She glanced toward the alley. "Parking is really hard there, I've heard." She hesitated. "I hope you don't mind me asking. But is it true you turned down their offer?" "Yes. Even with the money?" "Yes." She looked genuinely puzzled. "Why?" I smiled gently. "Do you see that apple tree?" She nodded. "My husband planted roses here, the year before he died," I continued. "I planted tomatoes every summer since. This garden helped me survive lonely years." Her expression softened slightly. "But it's just a garden." I shook my head. "No, it's a life." She didn't argue after that. She simply nodded and walked back toward the apartment building. But later that night, as I watered the roses, I noticed something surprising. 2 other residents had come to stand near the fence. One of them pointed at the apple tree. Another bent down to smell a rose. For the first time since the trucks arrived, I felt something new growing in the air around the garden. Curiosity, and perhaps even understanding. I didn't know it yet, but the fight over my garden was about to become bigger than just me and a development company. Because sometimes when one person refuses to give up a small piece of land, it reminds others that they still have the right to protect the places that matter to them. And once that idea begins to spread, it becomes very hard to pave over.